Good morning everyone. I'm so happy to be here. It really is a joy to see you all and to share with you some of John Paul II's powerful insights. We have a few, as we've said, a few technical issues. We can't move this, please move this sign. It just keeps coming on and off, and we're slightly off here with the projector, but hey, you know, there's no perfect serenity this side of the grave. What I'd like to do really is to say, I think a big part of this day is networking, as it always is in the Catholic Church. And so I will be more than happy to chat with all of you, as many of you as I can. I'm here for the day, and just to exchange contact details and to help really in any way that I can. And the reason I say that is because I love what I do and the work I do, but I'm in a very privileged position. I'm a Sacred Heart father, and I live in my community in Stockport. I'm originally from the Holy Land, as I call it, Liverpool. So we're obviously celebrating wildly these days of glory. With the 20th Premier League title, but yeah, I won't rub that in. But I call myself really a freelance priest, and that means that I've been given great freedom by my community to engage in topics of theology of the body, retreats and talks for particularly men's ministry, but in general for the church. So this is my Theology of the Body healing retreat. I just have one copy here that I'm going to use. So if any of you are maybe involved in a group who would like me to come and run that Theology of the Body healing retreat, I'm happy to do that in whatever venue, and I have done that in a number of places. Because really the main crisis that I think we're experiencing, as we'll come to, is really a crisis in anthropology. That is the foundational crisis, I believe, in our culture at the moment. And I know, being such an educated audience, a lot of these insights I don't think will be particularly new for you, but it's just to say we can't define what it means to be a man or a woman. I think that is really the heart of the crisis. If you look back over the history of the church and the way the creedal formulas were brought together by the magisterium of the church, they address different conflicts and the nature of God, the Father, the identity of Jesus, the Holy Spirit, Mary, all these things. And I think that, as I say, the conflict of our times is the crisis in anthropology. And the Theology of the Body, I think, speaks directly into that. The Holy Spirit always gives the church the antidote for the woes. And I do believe that is John Paul II's particular legacy. He was an apostle, they say, of the human person, of marriage. And so his wonderful teaching, I think, speaks directly into this crisis. So there's always so much we could do, but just to share with you some of the insights. I'm sure most of you have heard of Theology of the Body. Would that be correct? And has anyone read the entire catechesis from cover to cover? It's quite a task. Well, Christine and myself have just recently finished going through every audience, and it's online. You'll find it on YouTube. We did 2 audiences a week, and it's fair to say we didn't break the internet. It's a niche topic, but it was very wonderful just to talk through with the help of some commentaries. So it's a powerful catechesis, but it is difficult to navigate. So we'll just wade in here with some insights. One of the many things that strikes many people about the Theology of the Body when they encounter it for the first time is its unremitting positivity. It is not about following a set of rules in a negative sense, but is rather a something of the good news of the body and of the beauty of God's plan for human love. It is about the genuine development and happiness of the human person, the proclamation of the good. So why is that important? I think it's important for this reason, because in the past, and some of the older members here may remember, that topics of sexuality and morality, because they are very sensitive and difficult to talk about, even as maybe parents and grandparents, they were often framed in a very negative light. Whatever you do, don't do that. Don't do this, don't do that. And so I think as we developed into our adolescence, there's a natural questioning, even a natural rebellion. And so a lot of the issues of sexual morality have been, I think, tainted by that negative connection, that somehow these things are bad or dirty or difficult. And I think the vision of St. John Paul II is to lead with truth and beauty. And that, I think, is really transformative, that you present the vision of theology of the body in all its goodness and richness. And once you grasp that, you begin to see the counterfeit expressions of that. And so I think that in terms of our evangelization and proclamation, that's a really key principle. And I think someone like Bishop Robert Barron is very keen to emphasize that, to lead with beauty and truth, not with no, sexual morality, you can't do this, you can't do that. And so there's a wonderful vista, I think, or this horizon, this beautifully attractive horizon that John Paul II presents. And one of the many things I love about the guy is his boldness. And again, it's to speak with that boldness, that the church is the truth and the teachings are true and beautiful and good, and are about human flourishing. God wants us to flourish. And so again, maybe people in the church, members of the church, leaders of the church, haven't always led with that, I think, that gift or that vision. So the satisfaction of the passions is in fact one thing. So that's the sexual revolution, and many other ways in which we can satisfy the passions. In fact, one thing, quite another, is the joy a person finds in possessing himself more fully, since in this way he can become more fully a true gift for another person. The words of Christ spoke on the Sermon on the Mount direct the human heart precisely towards this joy. We must entrust ourselves, our thoughts and our actions to Christ's words in order to find joy and give it to others. And so again, this is the fundamental gift of our sexuality. The right use of that leads to great joy and fulfillment. And the incorrect use of that leads to terrible sadness, terrible bitterness, terrible regret, anger, and tragic consequences. And so, in a sense, the theology of the body covers all the hot button topics, and we're going to have a look at one shortly. Maybe the hottest of all the hot button topics is the transgender phenomenon. That in a lot of circles in today's culture, this will lose you your job. This will literally, if you mispronounce someone's pronoun, you're going to be hauled in front of a court or whatever, and all kinds of disciplinary measures. And so, it's to channel the boldness of JP2 and to not be afraid. So this is just a very, very simple overview of the theology of the body. So you might have seen the Wallstein's edition, the definitive edition, published I think in 2006. It really is a tome, you know. It's difficult to carry around in your bag, you know, because it's such a monster kind of book, but it's actually very simple. There are just 2 parts and 3 sections in each part, so just 6 parts. That's the entire Theology of the Body catechesis. And so just to read really the beginning, I'm sure, as I say, you know most of this, but it's to recognize the history of where it came. So during the general audience in September the 5th, 1979, John Paul II announced his intention to initiate a new cycle of reflections for public dissemination. This new cycle would complement the preparations for the upcoming Synod on the Family taking place in Rome during autumn of the following year. The Pope acknowledged that many people felt a particular responsibility for the tasks that Christ gives to marriage and to the Christian family. His new cycle of reflections had the goal of accompanying from afar the work in preparation for the Synod, not, however, directly touching its topic, but by turning attention to the deep roots from which this topic springs. And so my understanding is that there was a long history of this development, that John Paul II, as Archbishop of Krakow, could see the poorly received teaching of Humanae Vitae, published in 1968 by Paul VI, who's here with us on the side of the wall somewhere. And in that document, which is a beautiful document, I'm sure many of you read it, Humanae Vitae, it's a narrow teaching on a very specific issue, on artificial contraception. But in that document, he speaks about the need for an integral vision of the human person. And that is what John Paul II took up in his Theology of the Body. He wanted to present that integral, that complete or holistic vision of the human person. As I say, that beautiful, broadest possible vista of how we understand the human person. And once we grasp that, we can then understand, if you like, the narrow magisterial teaching of Humanae Vitae. So that really is the context. And so, as the commentators say, the Theology of the Body catechesis is really an extended commentary on Humanae Vitae. That's really his intention to do that, was to continue that work of Paul VI and to try and embed that more fully into the lives of Catholics. So my understanding is that he wrote the Theology of the Body in its entirety as he was Archbishop of Krakow, and he took it to Rome to the conclave, because some of you may remember Pope Paul I was elected, but he only lasted a month. And so all the cardinals came back to Rome, and Karol Wojtyła had this manuscript that he was intending to publish as a book as Archbishop of Krakow. He was then providentially elected John Paul II in that second conclave, and it then became his first catechetical project of his pontificate that was disseminated, as you know, during the Wednesday audiences over a 5-year period, I think from 79 till 84. And there was a break, of course, in the middle for him being shot, which is quite extraordinary. Now, there's so many different, stories within stories, and the connection to Our Lady of Fatima, and the messages of Fatima and the errors of Russia, which I think are this, neo-Marxist, radical feminist ideology that's so pervasive in our culture, and there's so much we could say about that, which is equally inflammatory and controversial. All these things kind of tend to follow me around. But on the day he was shot, and it's extraordinary, even the story of that assassination attempt, he was shot 5 times, it's unbelievable. That on that day he was shot in, I think it was 81, wasn't it, in May 81. What he was going to do was to open the Institute for Marriage and Family to disseminate this material. And someone didn't want that to happen, and so he was shot as a way to try and stop that. Our Lady prevented his death because his mission, I think, was so important. And that was then eventually opened, the Institute of John Paul II in the Lateran University in Rome, and there's the subsequent other institutes kind of were given birth from that. So I think it's a very important message. I think one of the messages of Our Lady of Fatima to Lucia was that the final battle will be over marriage and family, which I think we are witnessing these days. I think there's a tremendous attack on marriage today. I think even those couples who are generous enough to take on marriage, I think it's very, very difficult, isn't it? And just this a consumer mentality that has become so ravaged and distorted by the pornification of our culture. Again, to really speak, I think the theology already speaks very squarely into that. Very sensitive, very damaging reality of the epidemic of internet pornography. We can maybe have some reflections on that. So marriage and family, and again, even like beautiful things that many of you maybe have read, Love and Responsibility. Have any of you read Love and Responsibility? Really a very profound original piece of work that was a collection of lectures that he gave, I think, in Lublin University. And some of the topics, some of the subheadings are really quite explicit in many ways in that book. So writing, I guess, in the the 50s, really in Poland. That must have startled some of his students with some of the the content of that beautiful teaching. So very, very simply, back to the theology of the body, the 3 parts, or the 2 parts and the 3 sections of each part. The beginning, the middle, and the end. So historical man, original man, historical man, and eschatological man. And so this famous triptych that we'll see shortly is the entire first part. Original man, historical man, eschatological man. And then the second part, called the sacrament, is basically an extended commentary on Ephesians 5:21-33. So we'll just have a read of that. So it really is a biblical anthropology. John Paul II's Theology of the Body Catechesis is a biblical anthropology, as I say, developed quite uniquely to flesh out and embody the teaching of Humana Vitae, as I say. And so each of these sections begins with a quote from Scripture. Some of them are not exclusively, in Matthew. Certainly eschatological man is in all 3 synoptic gospels, but they're just a selection. So here we are. You can't quite see that, which is a shame. But so this is basically the first part, and this is why is this kind of so powerful. I think for many reasons is because of the crisis in anthropology. What almost is the fundamental crisis of everyone today is their identity. No one knows who they are. And if you don't know who you are, then you don't know where you're going or where you came from. And so, as we look at what does the epidemic of internet pornography in our world reveal, that's only a manifestation of a deeper problem. The deeper problem, I believe, is loneliness. There's an epidemic, a global epidemic of loneliness. And that global epidemic of loneliness is because of a crisis in identity and a crisis in the family. So we don't know who we are, and we're looking, all these online forums, searching, scrambling for a tribe, someone I can fit in with. Where do I fit in? And so the Theology of the Body catechesis, and I often link it together with the Catechism of the Catholic Church that we're going to look at very briefly, that is an equally stunning document. So what is basically this famous triptych of John Paul II? Original man is life before the fall, that we know from the book of Genesis. There are two accounts, Genesis 1 and 2, and it's where we came from. That's really important, where we came from. How did humanity start? What is my origin? What are my forefathers or my foremothers? That tells me something about our common identity, and that's important because, as I say, there's a real crisis and this kind of global rootlessness. Where am I from? Where is my home? So John Paul II takes his listeners back to the question about divorce and remarriage. He says, in the beginning, this was God's original plan. This was how God intended man and wife to live. And so he's taking us back to the beginning. And so this is our origins, that original harmony, how it went wrong. This is the origin of the human story, the foundations of our identity. And so, as grandparents would tell their grandchildren, how did I come to be? Granddad or grandma, well, this is how you came to be in this country, or this is how you came to live in Birmingham or London. This is a key part of our story. We move then into historical man. And so so that is, we can't quite read it, but it's our present conflictual situation. And so original man is something that we have no experience of before the fall. Historical man is our present condition that we all experience. And then as we come to eschatological man is our future destiny. And so we have no direct experience, as I say, of original man, that pristine condition of Adam and Eve before the fall. And we have no direct experience of the eschatological reality in the kingdom of heaven. All we know is this present historical condition. And that is marked by a series of conflicts that St. Paul speaks about in Romans chapter 8, verses 14 and following, when he says, I do the very things I hate. I don't do the things I want to do, but do the very things I don't want to do. What a wretched man I am. Who can save me from this plight? And so we recognize that our desires are conflicted, that we want to do something, we want to be a kind of person, but we recognize our performance often falls short. And why is that? That's like quite a revelation, I think, for a lot of people. And so we start, many times in January with New Year's resolutions, don't we? We're like, okay, this is it now, this is it. I'm going to get up, 6 a.m., 3 times a week, out for a jog, I am off alcohol, I am off chocolate, I'm off sugar, I'm off Netflix, I'm off Facebook, you know, and you get in like 2 weeks in, don't you? And it's like, bang. You know? So why is that? Why is that? You know, that's kind of like curious. Yeah, why is that? Why can't I kind of like sustain this aspiration? That is because of that internal rupture as an effect of original sin. So that's something that the secularists do not agree with. Again, is all these competing anthropologies. For those of you in therapy or some kind of accompaniment, there's no such thing as a presuppositionless anthropology. Everyone is working out of a view of the human person, whether that's explicit or implicit. And that's really significant.
Father, repeat what you just said.
There's no presuppositionless anthropology. So everyone is working out of an implicit view of the human person. So all the main players, the Freudians, you know, the Jungians, the Rogerians, Carl Rogers, all these big players have their own anthropology. That seeps into education and, you know, the NHS for sure, which is, of course, you know, part of that is this transgender phenomenon that we'll look at. So what is your anthropology? You know, to ask yourselves that question, yeah, what kind of vision of the human person am I working out of, you know, in my professional or personal life? Because someone like Carl Rogers would deny categorically the presence of original sin. For example, he would have no intrapsychic conflict in his model of the human person. He would simply blame his external environment. And so if someone is exhibiting dysfunctional behavior, it's because of their deprived environment. That if you took them out into a more accommodating or more of a, you know, beneficial external conditions, their behavior would change. Now, there's a partial truth in that. It is, you know, like all these kind of anthropologies, but fundamentally he would deny the fact of original sin, that someone can have the best possible upbringing, the most privileged education and parenting, and still wreck their life because of my own conflict. Nothing to do with the environment or my parents or my teachers. So that's why, yeah, anthropology is really key. Because if someone fundamentally doesn't have an acceptance that something went wrong, that there's a fracture, then you're on very, very shaky ground as regards trying to help someone. And so, you know, a fair amount of people who come to see me eventually come to see me as a clinical psychologist, but knowing I'm a Catholic priest, because their anthropology will match mine. And I say that very clearly, you know, whereas if you go to a secular psychologist or a secular therapist of some kind, there's a completely different horizon of meaning, a completely different vision and understanding of the human person. So there's much more we could say about what we call the basic dialectic, and I go into it more in my retreat. The basic dialectic is really a conflict between my ideal self and my actual self. So they are psychological terms that explain St. Paul's anthropology, which is a fundamental Christian anthropology. So that's why we struggle. That's why we struggle, and that's why we can't idolize. One of the reasons, you know, there's many things we can say as a result of that, but one of the reasons why we can't idolize any of our leaders, particularly not our politicians, not that any of us do, blimey, but it's kind of like, you know, if we only had the Conservatives in power, everything would be different. If we only had Labour in power or Reform UK or whatever it is, if you have a sober understanding of this anthropology, you recognise that every leader is inherently conflicted and weighed down by that effects of original sin. And there will be resistance to growth and change. A life of consistent virtue is difficult. And I would say almost impossible without the grace of God. And so the insights of Christian anthropology are so transformative, so revelatory, so beautiful, and it's so sad that they're so discarded. Now, right in the middle of this historical man, this middle period of history that we all experience, is Jesus. And so that's a really significant piece. The people of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, did not have the same access to grace that we have in the New Covenant. They did not have the 7 sacraments of the church. They had the teaching of Moses and the prophets, which were good and solid, but imperfect. And so JP2 says that this middle section, we are in this very privileged era of life in Christ. So we can't go back to the past. We can't go back to the pristine original blueprint of Adam and Eve in the garden. But life in Christ can propel us towards that. That restoration, that rehabilitation is offered to us through the grace of the sacraments. And so the fallen human nature can be bolstered, empowered, transformed, and redeemed through the grace of the church, the Catholic Church. And so that is good news. That is a very privileged position that we all can experience as readily as we can. And so then finally, eschatological man, that is the end of, that is our hope. And so the intrapsychic conflicts, so there's 4 conflicts that have resulted from original sin. So the interior conflict, that my passions are not in line with my reason, So it's a Friday in Lent, for example, and we're walking past like a Millet and Carter restaurant, and we're like, those steaks, oh my word, they smell so good. So our passions are leading us in a completely opposite way to our mind, our virtue, our life of virtue. No, we're determined. And so that's the intrapsychic conflict. The other conflict is our spiritual conflict. What did Adam and Eve do after they had sinned as regards their relationship with God? They hid. Imagine trying to hide from God. How kind of weird is that? As if like he can't see through a door or something, But we do the same, don't we? We do the same. We try to hide from God and hide our shame and our sin. It's still there. That's the second conflict. The third and drastic, dreadful conflict, so prevalent today, is the interpersonal conflict, that conflict between men and women. And so that wasn't the case, as we'll see. Adam and Eve were naked without shame. It's a beautiful and extraordinary line in Genesis that John Paul II really hones in on. That they had what he calls the peace of the interior gaze. So again, we're trying to filter through this pornified interference that we have, to recognize our sisters, our female sisters in their beauty and dignity, and our male, brothers in their beauty and their dignity. So that interpersonal rupture needs massive healing. And then the fourth rupture of historical man is our environment. And so God says to Adam particularly, it's through the sweat of your brow that you will now earn a living. So they're the conflicts that I go through in the retreat there so it's a work-life balance. It's a work-life balance to try and get that right. There's this curious epidemic of busyness, isn't it? So funny. I'm kind of a little bit kind of bold myself, and people say to me, "Oh gosh, Father, you must be really busy. You must be really busy." And I'm kind of going, "No, not really. No, I'm not really busy." And they're like, "What?" And it's not often. This is so bad, because people do have a lot of work, But I think it's Bishop Robert Barron, who I wouldn't fully agree with on every single theological thing that he speaks about, but he gets a lot of very good things right. It's a form again of identity, isn't it? That somehow, if you're not busy, you're no one. You're kind of nothing. You're not busy? No, I'm not busy. What do you mean you're not busy? Well, I'm actually just standing here talking to you. So does that mean I'm busy? I don't know. I'm just having a coffee with a friend or something. It's a malady of the mind. It's a malady of the mind, I think. So it's to try and do work. I absolutely love my work. I love my work. I'm very blessed. Put in a good shift, the dignity of human work. But it's to do that in a recollected way. It's to do that in an unhurried, live in that present moment, to recognize everyone in their inherent dignity. So they're the four ruptures: interpersonal, spiritual, intrapsychic, spiritual, interpersonal, and a habitational rupture. It's called work-life balance. So women tend to find the interpersonal rupture more difficult. Men tend to find the habitational rupture, the work-life balance. Again, it's all about identity. And then the fifth and final rupture is, for 10 points, death. Death. The rupture of the body from the soul at the moment of death. And Jesus came to restore everything. So he has conquered death through his resurrection. Thanks be to God. And so what John Paul II says, that in eschatological man, those conflicts will cease. There will be complete integration. At the resurrection of the body, there will be that reunification of the soul with the body at the final coming of Jesus Christ in glory. And that is eschatological man. And so you see this beautiful vision, as I was saying, this kind of identity. Where have I come from? What is the cause of my present woes? How can I find that healing, and where am I going? You see how that, for a lot of people, that is like, wow, that's like a revelation. I never knew that. That is the truth, the absolute truth of who we are as human beings. And that is such a valuable piece of information, because people are just walking around in this daze. Who am I? What am I on this earth to do? That's why, these recent dreadful statistics, I think they've been published in America. Diseases of despair. I don't know if you've heard of these diseases of despair. Check them out. So they're making a huge impact now in the States on the mortality rates of average Americans. And so they are, death through suicide, death through overconsumption of alcohol and drug addiction, because people are just despairing about life. And so this recent bill on euthanasia, well, that's not such a big deal. If you have no hope in life, then what's your problem? We can just kill people if they kind of feel a bit bored or they're getting a bit old and sick. What's the big deal? There's a friend of mine who's so, he's even more kind of mischievous than me, Neil, in our men's group, and he writes to politicians. He's so funny. So he wrote to Keir Starmer and he said, I think the bill should be called obligatory suicide. Obligatory suicide. So once you hit 65 retirement age, it's just obligatory suicide, because basically they're trying to couch this, in these kind of compassionate terms, aren't they? Oh, this is really helping the kind of person, let's just call it for what it is. If you finish work, you're not kind of contributing to society. Well, just take your own life. It's okay, Talk about the thick end of the culture of death. So, just again to sort of dive in a little bit deeper into original man. So original man, these beautiful sections of JP2's teaching. So within original man, he has these three states that again are very powerful and very beautiful, tell us a lot about our identity, and he calls them original solitude, unity, and nakedness. So this is all in this. So this is all the blueprint, if you like, of the human race. So how are we to understand man and woman? Well, let's go back to God's original plan. If you break open a kind of model, like a model, like steam train for your son at Christmas, what's the first thing you do? You get all the pieces out. Well, like, how do these go together? Well, you go to the blueprint. So this is what John Paul II is doing. As he answers these questions to the Pharisees, he says, Moses, as allowed divorce because of the hardness of your heart. So what were the men doing in Moses' time? They were killing their wives. That's what they were doing. It's just, it's just awful. I mean, we think we're so enlightened, we're just killing our old people and our children, So, not to make light of that in any way, it was awful, A couple would go away on holiday and a couple of weeks the guy had come back and they'd say, oh, where's kind of Hannah? Oh, I don't know. She just didn't come back, So he allowed divorce because of that as a lesser evil to protect and save these poor women. So this is the argument that JP2 begins following Jesus's logic, and he says it was not so in the beginning. And so Jesus is taking his hearers back to the beginning, which is us. And so John Paul II is just following that line of teaching of Jesus, if that makes sense. This is God's pristine view. And so this very powerfully unique contribution of John Paul II to biblical anthropology, he says, original solitude has two meanings, one more positive and the other more negative. The realization that the man and the woman are alone among the animals, the only rational animal willed by God and able to enter a relationship with God, their creator, through either love or rebellion. So that is beautiful. That's a beautiful realization that you'll remember from those two accounts of Genesis, that all the animals were paraded before Adam. And he couldn't find a companion. He couldn't find someone to really share his life with. The lions and the tigers, the giraffe, yeah, they're fascinating. We love these animals, but you can't enter into communion with them. We can enter into a relationship with God. We're able to understand the moral complexity of the laws and regulations that were set by God in the garden. You can eat of all these trees, but this one you can't. So man and woman are able to grasp that as rational beings. So that's really good and really positive. But the other negative meaning of that original solitude is that man and woman were alone without each other, and this was the only thing that God saw that wasn't good. And so again, there's that desire that we have. You remember that wonderful gasp of Adam when he met Eve, at last, bone from my bone. This beautiful realization of the other. So that experience of falling in love, and there's so much we could say about that, so much that in scripture about that, so much the mystics, so much in your romance, all the wonderful literature and poetry down through the ages, that experience of falling in love. And then original unity, and this is gets to one of the most core fundamental signature statements of the entire catechesis, and it's in Turby Audience 9. What is original unity? It says that men and women were created to become a communion of persons. So what does that mean? What does JP2 say? Well, he says that man became the image of God, man and woman, he means, not only through his humanity, but also through the communion of persons, which man and woman form from the very beginning. Man or woman becomes an image of God, not so much in the moment of solitude as in the moment of communion. So what is JP2 saying? That is an absolutely stunning statement. He's saying that the man, Adam, and the woman, Eve, are both two separate incarnations of the image of God. Man and woman, both rational creatures, equal in dignity, both expressions, both in the image and likeness of God individually. But they most image God as a communion of persons in that sexual union. Isn't that extraordinary? Why is that? Because the man and the woman coming together as man and wife, that gift of self, that procreative, life-giving, full gift of self, that union most images the life of the Blessed Trinity. And that's why marriage is so precious and so important and so powerful. Now that is really, I think, a life-changing insight. And we'll see as we look that the whole of creation speaks of marriage. This is how salvation history is really presented to us. And that's why Our Lady said that the final battle will be over, marriage and the family. And that is what is most under attack by these very dangerous ideologies so prevalent in our culture today. So that's a stunning realization, which is why this teaching on artificial contraception, as we see, is such a direct attack on that image, the emptying out of that life-giving generative power is a real attack on the identity, if you like, of the Blessed Trinity, original unity. And then the final state is original nakedness. They were without shame. They did not view each other as sexual objects, but with the peace of the interior gaze, loving each other in their entirety, not needing to protect themselves from the temptation of lust, exploitation, or domination. They only experienced each other as a pure gift and sought only to make a gift of self to the other. And so again, these are beautiful truths of that original blueprint of design, and we think we have echoes of that. There's a sense in which I think people are kind of sensitive with their conscience that something has gone wrong, that this isn't how it should be. there's a sense in which this is how it should be, and this is just, it's fallen away. So JP2 is following, as I say, that didactic logic of Jesus, taking us back to the beginning. And this, my dear brothers and sisters, is a tragic fact of the theology of the body. And it's something I experienced very powerfully at the Theology of the Body Institute over there in Pennsylvania. That many people hearing this message for the first time can get quite angry and upset. And they say time after time, why did I not hear this earlier? Before I became chewed up by our wretched culture. And that is an absolute tragedy, particularly for our young people, you know, maybe some of you at university or the beginning of your life, to see the ravages of the misuse of this gift, this God-given, beautiful, stunning gift of our sexuality as men and women. John Paul II is just presenting that to us in its beauty, that Christ can redeem your masculinity and your femininity and give you a taste of how God intended us to live. That is what Christ came and did, and that is the good news. So the second part then, I think it is, so that's so historical man, original man, historical man, eschatological man. The spousal meaning of the body. How do we understand the spousal meaning of the body? So, 1 second now, he says, oh yeah, here we go. So original solitude, unity and nakedness reveal man to us in the dimension of gift. This means that God created man and woman in such a way it was self-evident to them before sin corrupted their vision. They were created and called to love and give themselves to one another as a gift. So again, you know, I guess maybe we're so used to this within the Catholic Church in some ways, but that is a profound revelation. Everyone is looking for happiness. That is a universal desire, I would say. Even the poor guy, you know, who's, you know, involved in a life of drink or hedonism or, you know, I mean, we even call these drugs ecstasy. That's what we're seeking. We're seeking ecstasy. What does that word mean? It means a self-transcendence. It means a going outside of the self. So that is merely a counterfeit expression of this. It doesn't bring ecstasy. It brings kind of like, you know, despair and mental health problems, chemically changing your brain. But they're on the right lines. And so St. Augustine, now, God bless him, Leo the 14th, an Augustinian priest, those who are lost in their passions are less lost than those who have lost their passion. That's St. Augustine. So that's the beauty of the two sons in Luke 15, according to Benedict XVI, erroneously called the prodigal son. It's really the parable of the two sons because they're both equally important. One of them is lost in his passions, and one of them has lost their passion. Now they're both lost. They're both lost. See, the father comes out of his house to both of them. You see, because they're both outside of the father's house. He comes, humiliates himself. Patriarchs in the Old Testament didn't do that. They received even their own family to themselves. They never came out, and he never ran. The father ran to the younger son. The hearers of that in first century Judaism would have been horrified, like a patriarch, like running. Imagine like seeing, you know, the Queen of England kind of running. You're like, wow, that wouldn't have happened. You know, you can't even kind of touch her, never mind high five her, you know. kind of fist bump, old Charlie boy, do you know what I mean? So they're both lost, but the one who is lost in his passions is less lost than the one who's lost his passion. Why? Because those passions reorient the son back to the father. And that is often the case. And so the task of evangelization, dear brothers and sisters, is simply to tap that son on the shoulder who's eating from the pig trough with all that ecstasy and say, mate, there's a banquet in the Father's house. You don't need to eat that rubbish. You don't need to lose your life in drink, drugs, sex, and hedonism. You have it all here in the Father's house. This is true ecstasy. That's a task of evangelization, to reorient the eros that previously sent him away, that the eldest son has lost completely. And so he's not going anywhere in both senses. He's not leaving, but he's not in the Father's house. And so original solitude, naked, and unity and nakedness reveal God is stamped in the very human body as male and female, a reminder that we are to be a gift of ourselves to the other. He stamped that in the female body, and he stamped that in the male body. That is the core of the theology of the body. Every time you look at a man's body, you go, gosh, what does that mean? What does that kind of genitalia mean? What's its function? And the same with the female genitalia. Gosh, look, that's very interesting. Now, what is the transgender ideology seeking to obliterate? See the very heart of that, what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. That's why it's a direct assault on God's plan. So we'll come to this. Which system of the human person, the only system, does require the cooperation of men and women? In biology, talk about following the science. Which system? The reproductive system, yeah. Isn't that funny? Imagine kind of explaining that to like an alien or something. How does a human person work? Well, we have the digestive system, we have the endocrine system, we have the cardiovascular system. Oh, that's interesting, yeah. All these kind of systems are closed biological systems within the human person, the man and the woman. One system alone requires the cooperation of both. That is the reproductive system. So that's not even mentioning God. That's just human biology. And so what does that mean? That, John Paul II says, that is God stamping his identity into our very incarnation. That call to communion, that we are called to come together in that sexual union to generate new life. And that most images the life of the Blessed Trinity. Isn't that like a stunning insight? So this dimension of gift is imprinted on everyone and means that each of our bodies has a spousal meaning. This meaning tells us that our common human vocation is to offer ourselves as a gift through our bodies. That is through our masculinity and femininity. Our bodies are a gift and sign of God's love, and we in turn are called to share this love with one another in and through our bodies. And so Catechism, paragraph 16, 17, the entire Christian life bears the mark of the spousal love of Christ and the church. So what does that mean for me, for example, as a priest? Who am I married to? How do I live my spousal relationship? Got some bad news, guys. You've drawn the short straw. We're married. We are married. That's true. Honestly, we're married. I live out my spousal relationship with you, my bride. Where does a priest do his formation? Where does he train to study to become a priest? Does anyone know? In a seminary. Yeah, what does the word seminary mean? It's Latin, yeah. Seminarium, for seedbed. So I trained in a seedbed. Why? In order to inseminate my bride with the living word of God, so that you can give birth to Jesus as Mary did in her body. That's how I live out my spousal relationship. And that's why only men can be priests. It's not because, women aren't great at organizing stuff. Of course they are, they're brilliant, But as we come to this great sacrament, Ephesians 5:21, as Christ gives his life for his bride, so a husband gives his life for his bride. And I give my life for my bride, which is you, the people of God. So you see how this spousal imagery shoots through the whole of salvation. The whole of creation is singing this beautiful gift. Isn't it wonderful? Isn't it good news? Did we get this in our sex education classes in school? Did we? So the whole of part 2, here we go. The sacrament. I'll read it out. The full kind of text is beautiful. Ephesians 5. What does St. Paul say? Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ. Now this kind of triggers everyone, this next line. Wives should be subject to their husbands as to the Lord. Okay? Kind of what's it like, safe space? We need a safe space place, don't we? Since as Christ is head of the church and saves the whole body, so is a husband the head of his wife. Wow. And as the church is subject to Christ, so wives should be to their husbands in everything. Husbands, however, should love their wives just as Christ loved the church and sacrificed himself for her. We don't kind of hear that as much. To make her holy by washing her in cleansing water with a form of words, so that when he took the church to himself, she would be glorious with no speck or wrinkle or anything like that, but holy and faultless. In the same way, husbands must love their wives as they love their own bodies. For a man to love his wife is for him to love himself. A man never hates his own body, but he feeds it and looks after it. That is the way Christ treats his church, because we are part of his body. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and becomes attached to his wife, and the two become one flesh. This mystery has great significance, but I'm applying it to Christ and the church. To sum up, you also, each one of you, must leave his wife. He must love his wife as he loves himself, and let every wife respect her husband. So that is Ephesians 5:21-33, and that is the entire second section of the JP2 Catechesis of Theology of the Body, entitled The Sacrament. It's an extended commentary on that line, on that paragraph from St. Paul. And what is he saying? Well, again, he is revealing this beautiful plan of mutual submission in marriage. And I kind of say this, and, as always, I welcome your feedback. The word submission in St. Paul's language simply means to work under the mission of, to submission, work under the mission of. Now, I would posit this argument that if a woman preparing for marriage knows that her husband will give his life for her, will really truly do that, and for their children, she would happily work under that mission. Now, what is the problem with that? It's finding a guy who would do that.
What's in what mission?
Pardon?
What's the mission? The submission.
Yes, well, the word submission means working under the mission of. That's what the word means. So when Paul is saying wives submit to their husbands, it's working under the mission of their husband.
And what's that mission?
Well, the mission is to get the family to heaven. That's the husband's mission. Yeah. So the husband's mission is to give his life for his bride and his children as Christ gave his life for the church, his bride. That's the husband's mission. To get us to heaven. You know, that's all our mission, isn't it? Now, there's a powerful piece in the catechesis on his commentary on Genesis, is that there's an implication in JP2's mind that the man has a greater responsibility to protect the covenant than the woman, which I think is a beautiful thing and is a challenge and an invitation to men. So the two extremes, I think, to avoid for men, that unfortunately Adam fell into one of them, is abdication and domination of their responsibility. So Adam tragically fell into abdication. Where was he? You know, where was he when Eve was being questioned and grilled by the serpent? Well, he was probably on his Xbox or, you know, Sky Sports or Netflix or whatever, Deliveroo, you know, internet pornography. Abdication of his responsibility, and that is a big crisis, I believe, certainly in the church, in the hierarchy of the church, and, you know, the abdication of that responsibility of men to man up and take responsibility for their bride. And that's what I think deep down a woman expects. Yeah, you know, take leadership. Yeah, I want you to take the leadership. And if that isn't there, what does a woman do? Well, she steps up, because, well, if the husband isn't going to do it, well, someone's got to do it. She's well able to do it. So we have this tragic fallout, this interpersonal rupture. We're trying to restore these both these beautiful dignities. What is authentic masculinity? What is authentic femininity? And how do they complement each other? That is what I think Christ can offer, and this Tier B catechesis can offer. So, can we sum up the Bible in 5 words? Yes, we can. How do we sum up the Bible in 5 words? God wants to marry us. Isn't that amazing? That is amazing. So I kind of like have come on a massive journey with this theology of the body. When I first kind of came across it, it was actually with a beautiful group that's in London now, that were in Dublin, Pure in Heart. And I kind of thought, that's really good. You know, I met John Paul II, God bless him, in 2003, when he was very frail. I was actually in Rome when he died and when Benedict was elected. And I attended 3 of his last World Youth Days. It was Paris in 97, Rome 2000, and then Toronto in 2002. So reading the theology of the body, thinking, this is great. Thinking to myself, this is a branch of theology, you know, like moral theology or dogmatic theology, fundamental theology, you know, theology of the body. To realizing, wow, no. This is the entire salvation history, is spousal. When you think about it, the whole Bible just is there. What does the Bible begin with? In the book of Genesis, the marriage of Adam and Eve. The book of Revelation is the marriage of Christ and the church, the wedding feast. The 2 bookends. In the center, you have Jesus, the bridegroom. All the prophets of the Old Testament call the people of Israel back to that spousal fidelity. It's not a contract, it's a covenant, a marital relationship. And at the heart of the 73 books of the Bible is the Song of Songs, the most commented book of the Bible by all the mystics and saints. Isn't that interesting? The Song of Songs, this beautiful love poetry. The commentators vary, is it between a man and a woman? Yes, it's between a man and a woman. Is it between God and his people? Is it between the human soul and God? All those, I think, are correct. But you see how we're in a spousal relationship, and so John Paul II really is just bringing that out into its beauty, that we are all called. And so the task really of every young person as they embark on their life of discipleship is very simple. How am I to live out my spousal relationship? That's a very simple question. How am I to do that? How am I to make a gift of myself? That is the ultimate way of finding happiness in our life, to die to the self as Christ did and to find life. It's a tremendously profound paradox of Christian discipleship. We think, if you do this, you acquire these things, you acquire these experiences, travel, degrees, money, girlfriends, cars, whatever it is, fitness regimes. That will all give us happiness. What happens when you achieve those things after many years of work? You're like, is that it? That's not fulfilling me. It's not fulfilling me. So we're still in the trough trying to satisfy these passions. So that is the entire second section. So the last part of the theology of the body, so the sixth section, if you like, the third part of part 2, brings together the insights of the first parts and applies them to the concrete ethical issues in the lives of men and women, and particularly the issue of contraception. So JP2 describes this last part, he says, as the crowning of what he has thus explained so far. And indeed, it's clear that one of the principal aims is to mount a vigorous and definitive defense of Paul VI's teaching in Humanae Vitae. Professor Michael Wallstein, who kind of compiled the definitive edition and has this very stunning but very lengthy introduction, emphasizes this point: there is a single argument that runs through the theology of the body. It is enriched by many sub-themes, but is in itself clear and simple. What is at stake in the teaching of Humanae Vitae about the inseparability of the unitive and procreative meaning of the conjugal act is nothing else than rereading the language of the body in truth. So as we'll see, and as Michael Wallstein says in that introduction, it's so powerful, it's so curious how this one simple teaching brings together so many fundamental components of the human person and this vision of marriage. It's a direct, but such a subtle attack on this whole beautiful vista of marriage and God, as John Paul II is trying to see and trying to help you to see. Okay, so this is the catechism, but maybe I'm not going to go on that. I think it's another little bit of more, people's heads melted. But so we'll finish there, and you're thinking, just have a break. So we're just going to have an introduction really to this phenomenon of transgender. And I think really, in truth, you guys are really on the coal face of this topic, working in the medical world and the NHS or whatever. I don't know where you all work, but it's very, very prevalent. And I think in all seriousness, there's a great sadness connected to this topic, because I know of many people really struggling in their workplace, struggling because of the prevalence, and in some ways, in some cases, a very aggressive nature in which this ideology is promoted. Now, without going into any, kind of personal oversharing of myself, I have lost a couple of jobs that I've loved through trying to, in some sense, challenge some of the disordered behaviour in the clergy, really, the hierarchy of the church. But I'm in a very privileged and a blessed position because I'm a religious priest, and for better or for worse, my order has to take care of me. God bless them, and they do. And I say that because I haven't got a wife and children and a mortgage and a pension, and you guys have. And so that makes a big impact in terms of speaking out on this issue. I'm just very, very aware of that. That, for me to lose a job in the seminary, it was tragic and very painful, but fundamentally I'm not homeless. I haven't been ejected from my order, but many of you face that possibility, and so I'm just aware of that reality as we look into that, as we look into this. And so I preface these talks that I do give with, I guess, just a pause, if you like, and a reflection, because making a stand against some of these prevalent ideologies will cost you. And it is a difficult decision for you to make, that you have to make for your families and your colleagues. And so there's some lines of scripture here that you all are aware of, but I feel are important. In John 15, it says, "If the world hates you, know that it has hated me before you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of this world, but because I chose you out of this world, therefore the world hates you. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you." And so Jesus has warned us. Jesus can see the arc of your life and the consequences of the choices that you have to make, and to speak out and to discern when to speak or when not to speak. So there is a sobering reality about, misgendering people and all the cases that we know that have happened in recent times. So just to frame that, because for some of you and for other friends that I have, there's been a radical reordering of their career possibilities and career potential because of coming into confrontation with certain ideologies very prevalent in education and medicine and all the institutions, and myself in the church, the Catholic Church. Okay, so again, these are things that you will know, So the books that I recommend, there's a recent book I've got by Jason Evett. I think it's Male and Female and Custom. It's a very good summary or synopsis of the transgender phenomenon in England and Ireland. There's books by Abigail Favali or Carrie Gress that cover these issues. I think Michelle Kreitella. These people in the States that you'll probably know. So we can't quite read the top of that, which is a shame, but anyway, it's there. So these are just trying to understand the condition of gender dysphoria. So someone who becomes subject to a delusion or a disordered assumption may be first aware of harboring feelings that are not in line with reality. But over time, these feelings generate an alternative reality in their own minds. So the comparison that I make myself of gender dysphoria is with the condition that you know of bulimia or anorexia nervosa, which is a distorted perception of your own body. Individuals with this condition believe themselves to be overweight when they are in fact dangerously thin, life-threateningly thin in a lot of cases. So thankfully, most psychiatrists still understand this self-assessment as a delusion. So the term delusion is used, cautiously, sensitively. The term is understood to be a fixed false belief which is held despite clear evidence. And so, at least in my mind, gender dysphoria, some of the elements of that condition are akin to a bulimia or anorexia nervosa, in that someone's perception of themselves is different to their bodily reality. And so again, equally alarmingly, I'm sure many of you are aware of this condition, body integrity identity disorder, in which individuals identify as a disabled person trapped in a fully functioning body. They can become so distressed by their fully capable bodies that they seek surgical amputation of healthy limbs or the severing of their spinal cord. I mean, this is really grave and tragic realities. So in what are called disorders of consciousness, a rational and compassionate psychiatrist would use as a starting point the recognition that a person's feelings are not always the same as reality. It is vital that we help our young people to accept reality when their false beliefs about themselves are not just emotionally distressing but potentially life-threatening. Sex reassignment surgery for gender dysphoria may appear to alleviate emotional distress for a brief period, but would do nothing to resolve the underlying psychological problems and might eventually lead to a person's death. So again, this is that recent book, Jason Evett. So they're just, some statistics of eating disorders. They're easily accessed, and also the transgender phenomenon, which seems to be in young teenage girls in the UK, very, very significantly higher than boys. And I mean, there's so many different things, so many sort of asides, but this is the kind of thing, this is the question that arises for me from, reading this literature. What message are we saying to young girls that gives them so much confusion or even hatred about themselves and their female body that they want to become a boy? That is something very tragic, isn't it, about our culture? So body integrity disorder, which is a condition when individuals feel that part of their body does not belong to them. They may express jealousy towards amputees or injure themselves to rid themselves of an unwanted limb, even if it is healthy. While some individuals who suffer with this can find a surgeon willing to perform an amputation for them, the consensus among medical professionals is that the therapeutic goal ought to be to conform the mind to the body rather than vice versa. That is really, really important. Because what does that do? That opens up a dualistic anthropology that we'll come to, which is really, I think, at the core of so many of these crises in the human person. That's an old heresy that goes back to the 3rd century, to this manichae, I think he was a Catholic priest, who St. Augustine fell under the influence of in his early life, that he extracted himself from as he converted into Christianity. So this Dr. Muller explains, instead of only curing the symptom, a casual therapy should be developed to integrate the alien limb into the body image. Unfortunately, the current approach to treating gender dysphoria is often the opposite. And so that is a really key. The modern approach is often to collude with the mind and interfere with the healthy body instead of the other way around. You see how that kind of subtle change has happened. A lot of these activists, it's really started with homosexuality in the APA's AGM in '73 and the overthrowing of that as a disorder. And that's the beginning of these kind of like power moves by activists to change the nomenclature. They see that as a key bridgehead. If we can change DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders in the States, then we can change people's understanding. There's no new evidence. There's no kind of like sound therapeutic evidence in most of these cases. It's just an ideological kind of shift. So what is it that defines a person? This Jason ever asks. It's an interesting question. Do feelings of self-perception reveal the deepest truth of the person's identity? When a person claims that he or she is trans, it cements a feeling into an identity and an ontological status. It becomes who they are rather than what they feel. But even if a person's identity hinges upon their feelings and beliefs, even if those experiences are persistent and deeply felt, the process of self-identification becomes unnecessarily difficult. If the body cannot be trusted to reveal the truth of the person, then why should feelings be trusted? And you see, so what Jason Everett does very well is he gently and compassionately, in my opinion, dissects these erroneous presuppositions of our understanding of anthropology, which is what we're trying to kind of get at here.
Would you like some water?
I'm okay, thanks. I've got some here, yeah, thank you.
Is Jason Everett a psychologist? Or?
From the Theology of the Body Institute in America.
Yeah, he's not, I don't think he, I think he has a master's degree, but I don't think he'd claim to be a theologian. He's a kind of writer. I think he's written a few books, but it's really a very good, there's nothing particularly new, radically new, but it's a synopsis of very good other authors, the book. So this is, what is a man, what is a woman? What does science tell us? Why do these things, when did these things become so controversial? It's that kind of like, wow. I know Trump in America, God bless the guy, is a little bit, nuts at the same time, but, he's talking about like a revolution in common sense. Like, when did we lose common sense? Do you know what I mean? Like, when did politicians lose common sense? Can't we have that? If you support the Conservatives or the Labour or whoever, surely we have to have common sense. Is it like, when did we lose that? It's like, wow. So what does a man's body do? How do we define a woman? Well, what does a woman's body do? You see this, trying to hopefully kind of bring all this together, this anthropology. A woman's body gestates, lactates and gives birth, and a man's body inseminates. That tells you something about our identity. That is science. That's the biology. That's how do we understand what a man is and what a woman is? Well, that's the theology of the body. And so again, standard textbook literature that you've all studied, I'm sure you all have to hand. The underlying basis of maleness and femaleness is a distinction between the reproductive roles of sexes. And so this, the basic distinction, the basic, dual distinction goes all the way through nature. Yes, there are strange abnormalities, tragic in some cases, of course, but there's fundamentally this distinction in nature. And that has never been questioned. This conceptual basis for sex roles is binary and stable in the vast majority of all of creation. Like, how did that come to be controversial? How did that come that even to say that was offensive or inflammatory? I mean, it's extraordinary how, we just descended into kind of madness, So just very briefly then, to run through this artificial contraception as the, I think the foundation of the crisis. I think that's what it says underneath that. Why is this so important? This is almost like the fundamental hinge that holds this whole edifice together. This whole kind of anthropology, this whole vision of marriage. What does the use of artificial contraception change between a couple having sexual intercourses? It introduces an imposition of the will of man to manipulate and control one of the most profound elements of the human person, being in the image and likeness of God. And that, again, as we'll look, is this dualistic anthropology that, again, we could, another time go back to René Descartes, the sort of 1500s, 16th century, I think, therefore I am. The modern beginning that the philosophers would say. I think he followed the work of the English philosopher Francis Bacon, and this will to dominate. So the mind becomes this all-encompassing power to manipulate what it wants. And so that's what's happening in artificial contraception. The mind is beginning to manipulate these powerful forces, and we think this is great, this is all just normal progress, and we can do this. So what happens, and this is the beginning of the descent, really, of civilization, in my opinion. This is the culture of death. We share God's creative gift of bringing a new eternal soul into existence. The use of artificial contraception interferes with this in a very significant way. So what does what happens to two people engaging in artificial contraception is sexual intercourse? Sexual intercourse becomes merely recreational activity. It becomes a sterile action, just undertaken because it's enjoyable and brings a feeling of intimacy or connection. This changes both of the individuals in a very dramatic way. And so we have, this is again, it's a startling reality that you begin with that subtle but seismic shift. So that activity now ceases to become procreative and fully unitive. It's a diminishment, a radical diminishment of that complete gift of self, of the man and the woman that we've seen is really the the fundamental direction and meaning of every vocation, that spousal gift. It renders that infertile, that deliberate manipulation of that sexual faculty. And so the act then becomes recreational. We see this, I was walking through Birmingham last night. Wow. A lot of people, out like revelers. So if the heterosexual community are having sterile sexual intercourse, well, what's the problem with the homosexual community doing the same? Well, there's no problem, is there? And that is according to Rowan Williams himself, the former head of the Church of England. He could see that logic, that you can't challenge, condemn or question homosexual activity because everyone else is doing it. So if you kind of if you take that, uncouple that procreative dimension, and then of course, if sexual activity is just merely recreational pastime, then it very easily becomes voyeuristic. So people can watch, people watch recreational activities like golf and tennis. It's great. So what does recreational, sterile, voyeuristic sexual intercourse look like? What is it? It's internet pornography. And so what is your problem? We're just all viewing recreational, sterile, voyeuristic behavior. And that all comes from artificial contraception, that once you manipulate that very, very powerful gift of our sexuality, everything begins to tumble. And as we know, if artificial contraception doesn't work, then it's okay. Because what can we do? We just have an abortion. And that's all abortion is. Abortion is necessary because of failed artificial contraception. And then if we're killing children in the womb, well, we can kill grandma and granddad, can't we? Because, what's the difference? Any mentoring, of young people, tragically, you will see very quickly the dreadful consequences and ravages of internet pornography and the increasingly abusive and aggressive nature of that. And, as you slowly begin to piece together what's really going on, if a young girl recognizes, actually, my boyfriend is just going to use my body like that, you can begin to understand why they're so desirous of wanting to shed themselves of that reality. It's not horrible. If that's what we're telling, 13, 14, 15-year-old girls, this is how we're going to use your femininity, then you can understand them not wanting to sign up for that. Yeah, I don't want to sign up for that. I want to be a boy. Because if that's how you're going to use my body, I don't want that, thank you. And you see that the aggression, the frustration, the resentment, the abuse of a woman's body by a man and vice versa is why we're desiring to permanently mutilate the healthy body parts. And so this is the core. This was an insight by Father Kevin O'Reilly, a friend, Dominican, a brilliant Dominican who teaches in the Angelicum. He gave a talk at a faith in the family conference in Rome a few years ago, and I was sitting in the auditorium and I was like, wow, I was so glad I was sitting down. An anthropological dualism, in whatever form it might take, involves the self inhabiting a body which it can manipulate according to its own whimsical designs, regardless of the indications inscribed within the body itself. That is the heart, the dark heart of the crisis in our anthropology today. That ancient heresy in the church that has manifested itself different epochs. There was the Albigensian heresy that precipitated the Pope of the time to initiate a crusade for the first time against Catholics in that was northern Italy and southern Spain, northern Italy, southern France, and it was the time of Saint Dominic and the Inquisition. And it was so grave that people stopped, reproducing, stopped having children, because of this dualistic heresy that the body is bad and the spirit is good. And so this grave denial of the body, and it's very, very aggressively anti-Catholic because it denies the incarnation of Jesus, who came in the flesh. This is the most powerful, startling revelation of the faith. So following Plato's famous maxim, society is man writ large, from the Republic, a totalitarian regime entails the head exercising arbitrary control over the body politic. In totalitarianism, the members of the body politic are sacrificed whenever those who rule deem it necessary for the advancement of their own designs. And so this is startling. And so if you have artificial contraception so widespread within and outside the church, you have millions of people in their own mind manipulating their own body. And Plato's society is man writ large. You have then this totalitarian living that exists because of artificial contraception. You see that kind of connection to the micro and the macro level. It's extraordinary. How easy it is. We kind of think, oh, we're being manipulated. We're being told to do this, we're being told to do that. Yeah, because you're doing it to your own body. Okay, we've got to wind up now. So, theology of the body and the Catechism of the Catholic Church are the absolute beautiful antidote of this tragic condition. All these are, readily available from the Catechism. The body, in fact, and only the body is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and divine. It has been created to transfer into the visible reality of the world the mystery hidden from God from eternity, and thus be a sign of it. And so God, in his beautiful wisdom, in the human body, by taking the form of a human body, has revealed to us the mystery of God. This man and this woman, this male and this female, the masculine body that inseminates, that initiates, the woman's body that receives and also gives, that gestates and lactates and gives birth. This is telling us something about the mystery of God. And this is why the transgender ideology is a direct attack on the Blessed Trinity. Now, you're not going to hear that on the BBC or Sky News. The transgender ideology is a direct assault on the existence of God and his plan for the human race to come to understand his inner dynamics. In the very sexual difference of man and woman's body is the revelation of God's innermost secret. A woman's body and a man's body coming together in that sexual union most reveal the life of the Blessed Trinity. Now that gulf is massive because the Trinity is not incarnational. Jesus is in his incarnate body, in his ascension back into the life of the Blessed Trinity in his body, his glorified, resurrected body. He has taken his place once more, and he shows us the way back to the Father. This is the rescue project. But in his body is stamped the very reality of that life-giving Blessed Trinity. It's a stunning, stunning revelation. See how these profound realities all stem from the same root word. What do our genitals reveal? They reveal our gender, which defines how we generate. Our genealogy tells us how we came here in the first place. We participate in the generosity of God through the generation of new life. We are obeying God's first commandment spoken to humanity in Genesis 1. Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. What happens to a society or a culture that stops generating life? It begins to degenerate. And degeneration is happening at a pace all around us. What is that? It's an awful word. It's not used that much, thankfully, but it's true. A degenerate refers to a person whose behavior or character has fallen below a generally accepted moral or social standard, often implying immorality or corruption. Dear brothers and sisters, this culture of life and culture of death is raging across Birmingham. It's raging across my heart. And we need the grace of God in order to restore that pristine beauty of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. Thank you, and God bless you.